What you call that noise?
The XTC Podcast.
What do you call that noise?
Okay, so Lucas, you're going to play some drumming by your favourite drummer, which obviously will be me.
No, it's Terry Chambers, but you are a very good drummer yourself.
Okay, so you had to say that because if you hadn't, you would have been sent to bed without any tea. Drumming is obviously a very sophisticated thing. You've had this drum kit for since Christmas now, although if you rehearsed a lot more, you'd actually be quite a lot better than you are, but you are pretty good, as people are going to hear in a moment when you play this. Can you just talk us through the various components of the ensemble of percussion instruments that you have in front of you?
Yeah. So we have the snare drum, we got the bass, we got the floor tom, we got the hi-hat, and we got the tom.
Right, so you just hit them, right?
I don't know what that means.
Well, I was doing an impression of Terry Chambers. Right, so over to you, pal.
That was 7-year-old Lucas showing his prowess on the drums in the company of Stephen Jackson, showing quality parenting skills. Thank you very much, Lucas, for kicking off this Making Plans for Nigel themed episode of What Do You Call That Noise? The XTC podcast.
What do you call that noise?
I'm Mark Fisher, and this time we're going to be talking not so much about the song itself as about the influence it continues to hold on the culture 40 years after its release. Only the other day, on the XTC's Limelight Facebook page, Swazik de St. John Ross observed there are currently 3 adverts that use the Making Plans for Nigel progression, and that didn't include Santigold's Disparate Youth, which was used heavily by an insurance company a few years ago. Well worth listening to that on YouTube to see what I mean. Beyond that, the phrase Making Plans for Nigel has gained a life of its own, independent of the song. Few headline writers, for example, can resist using it whenever Nigel Farage or any other famous Nigel is in the news. Coming up in this episode is Tom Clarke, formerly of The Enemy, whose Chronicles of Nigel, which is just released, brings Colin Moulding's character into the 21st century, as well as Laurie Nankivell from Squid, whose song Houseplants namechecks Making Plans for Nigel. In that conversation, we'll be making links between 1979, 2009 and 2021 and thinking about Nigel's shifting place in the cultural landscape. 1979, as older listeners will know, was the year Margaret Thatcher came to power in the UK, a couple of months before Making Plans for Nigel was released. And although you wouldn't call it an overtly political song, it came after a period of industrial unrest. It reflects an era when working-class parents would think an office job with British Steel would guarantee a safe and reliable future for their son. In those days, British Steel was a nationalised industry supported by Labour governments to keep employment high in depressed regions, so it did look like a safe job until the free market policies of the Thatcher government led to its privatisation in 1988 and consequent job losses. So by 2009, when Tom Clarke sang Be Somebody with The Enemy, which was the first time he imagined a future for Nigel, the line was, "There ain't no future in British Steel." In that song, to quote him, Nigel got a job in the city, works in a department store. In 2019, Squid's Houseplants included Making Plans for Nigel as part of a howl of rage by a band, and I'm quoting, "looking for a future that doesn't exist." Before we get into all that, we're going to a Manchester brewery. But first, a thank you to the generous supporters on Patreon who went to patreon.com/Mark Fisher, where they became Pink Things, Humble Daisies and Knights in Shining Karma. Thanks to all of you for making this podcast possible. I'll name check the Knights in Shining Karma at the end of this episode.
What do you call that noise?
Now, never let it be said that we don't do our research on the XTC podcast. With me now is Alex Parkinson from Alphabet Brewing, a Manchester company which has been making hop-forward and fruit-led beers since 2014 and whose range includes, wait for it, Making Pints for Nigel. And if you look at the can, you'll recognise the familiar Jill Mumford primary colours from Drums and Wires and illustrations of a whole host of Nigels, including Nigel Kennedy, the violinist, Nigella Lawson, the TV chef, and Nigel Planer from The Young Ones. At least those are the ones that I recognise. Alex, where did the idea come from?
A variety of things, really. So we have a colleague, Nigel, and he's quite diligent in his work. So quite gets on with stuff. From that, we started quite regularly making plans for Nigel in the brewery. It sort of became a almost daily tradition. And we thought, what better way to commemorate the man than to put him on the beer label? He quite regularly demands that he drinks out of a pint glass as well at our tap room, even though we usually only sell our beer in 2/3 of a pint size. So he's the only person who gets pints. So it all tied in quite well together.
That's fantastic.
He's also quite unwilling to be on. Have photos taken of him, so we thought it would be quite fun to have him. He's the one who's sort of the central Nigel on our label, surrounded by all the famous Nigels.
So he's the one I don't recognise. Then that makes sense. It's funny because I'm always seeing people on Twitter whose name is Nigel, and the only reason I spot them is because they're complaining that their school days were made, ruined by this song that was on the radio, and all their friends skitting at them all the time. But Nigel, is your Nigel proud to be a Nigel then?
He says they're a rare breed, and he said no Nigels should know other Nigels or acknowledge other Nigels, but there's a sort of a nod between other Nigels.
Yeah, it's true, and I think the name Nigel is it's sort of gone out of fashion, hasn't it? But I think nobody's being christened Nigel anymore, so it's very much a generational thing.
Oh, it's definitely a dying name. I think there's few of our Nigel's in his early 40s, but I don't know how many of Nigels there are who are in the 20s now.
Are there sort of closet XTC fans in the brewery, or is it just the coincidence of his name?
It was mainly sort of that. I mean, we really like the song as well. It's hardly been a pain to have to listen to that song every day.
yeah. And is it going down well with your customers?
Yeah, the beer's going really well. I think we plan to brew it again. Basically the beer as well, the concept behind the actual beer, rather than the label, is that Nigel isn't one for sort of our more modern styles of beer as well. So we wanted to make something different to what we usually do, because they're quite known for our sort of random ingredient heavy beers and our IPAs. But this was our first go at making a traditional bitter, which is something that Nigel's more interested in drinking. So we basically made effectively a Boddington's clone, or what Boddington's might have been like 30 years ago. So we actually used an old yeast from like what the Boddington's brewery used to use, and we use very traditional ingredients throughout the beer as well. So it all encompasses our Nigel, as well as everything around making plans for Nigel.
I hope he's very happy about this. He's got the tin designed after his name and the beer made in his honour.
No, he's very chuffed. We all take turns to put ourselves on the beer labels as well. So I think there's 10 of us here, and I think 6 of us have been on labels so far. We're trying to get everybody on there bit by bit.
And is it still available? You said you were going to brew it again. Is it available at the moment?
Yeah, it's currently available on our web shop. Yeah, alphabetbrewing.co.uk/webshop. But yeah, we plan to probably brew it a few more times. It's been a really successful beer, not just for sales, but also we're really happy with the quality of the beer. I think for the first time for us as a brewery, trying to do something slightly different. We're always making these modern beer styles, and to do something traditional for the first time and it go well has been a really big success for us.
That's been lovely to talk to you, and maybe we should get the real Nigel on at some point as well. What's Nigel's surname?
Lewis. You will not get him.
Nigel Lewis.
Get him on a phone or behind a camera.
Well, he's famous enough now, anyway. I think he's got a whole can named after him. Well, great. Well, good luck with it. As you say, alphabetbrewing.co.uk is where people can find you and find the beer if they want to order it. And thank you very much for doing this. It's great.
No worries. Thanks for your time, Matt.
What do you call that noise?
When people asked Colin Moulding on Facebook about making pints for Nigel, he replied that Nigel worked in the offices. He doesn't drink beer. Then he added, I think he had a moussec forced on him one Christmas at the office party and acquired a taste. Apart from that, he's teetotal. Moussec, incidentally, was a British sparkling wine, so that's what he's thinking of there. I emailed Colin Moulding to tell him I was doing this podcast, and he emailed me back and said, anyone can play with my Nigel as much as they like, which is good news for Tom Clarke. Yes. Hello, Tom.
Hey, we don't have to go to court.
So far, yeah.
So far.
And joining us is Laurie Nankivell of Squid. Hi, Laurie.
Hello, how you doing?
Very good, thank you very much. And it's great to have you on. Thank you for joining us. And Laura Wade, who is at the centre of a Venn diagram of fans of XTC, fans of the enemy, and fans of Squid. She's right in the centre of all that. And even more coincidentally, she lives just up the road from me, so that's very convenient. Hello, Laura. How are you doing?
Hello.
Good to see you. Tom, I did read that Be Somebody was written in a much the same manner as Senses Working Overtime was written, in the sense that you got the record company saying, we need a hit single, can you write something? Is that right?
Pretty much. Yeah. They'd kind of said we want another Had Enough in reference to our highest charting single to date. And if you listen to the chords of Be Somebody, it pretty much is Had Enough. But the sort of the subject matter was the bit that interested me on it. And that's where I kind of, at that time, I was totally obsessed with the song Making Pints for Nigel.
And was it just Making Plans for Nigel, or did you have a wider interest in XTC?
I'd love to say I had a wider interest in XTC. I'd heard some of their other stuff, but it was just that song I had an obsession with. I played it every single day. Every sound check we'd go to, Liam, our drummer, would play the beat. Not of his own fruition. I'd make Liam, our drummer, play the beat and try and figure out the guitar part. And I'm not a great guitarist, so it took a bit, but yeah, I was just totally obsessed with it back then.
And how did you get on with the beat? Because I'm told that from drummers that it's a simple beat to play once you get your head around it, but everything's back to front and upside down, and you don't hit the things you expect to hit.
Yeah, no, Liam was a far better drummer than he ever got to show he was in The Enemy. He was sort of a jazz fusion drummer, really. So he was just happy to be playing something that wasn't 4 on the floor for a change.
Yeah. And then it's intriguing that lyrically you were then interested in the song, because it's what the first thing you hear the song is that drum beat and the whole sound of it, but you got right under the skin of who Nigel was. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's really dark, and the cynical bit in me loves that. It's it's written with such enthusiasm and positivity at a time when the country was really about to, everything that was being manufactured in Great Britain was about to be sort of just gotten rid of, and so there's this deep, dark, cynical irony in there, but it's delivered in such an assertively positive way. It's I just loved that juxtaposition.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting historically, because you don't necessarily think of Making Plans for Nigel as being a political song, but in the political climate it came out of, 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power. That was just a couple of months before it was released, and it came after a period of industrial unrest, but it also reflects an era when working class parents could think an office job with British Steel would guarantee a sort of safe and reliable future for their son. So it was interesting then to think about what happened by the time 2009 came around, and there was no security in that sort of way for somebody in Nigel's position. Yeah,
it's maybe the last year of job security and being able to have a job for life. And then by the time Be Somebody was written, we were really sort of right in the middle of that generation who didn't get jobs for lives. The idea of a career when I was sort of 20 was, you had to be really, really smart and really clever, and me and most of my mates weren't.
Laurie, the reason immediately for bringing you on is that your fantastic song Houseplants, Squid's fantastic songs Houseplants, makes reference to Making Plans for Nigel. And this is a song now that's 40 years old. So being an old man myself, I regard that as somebody of your age who would be referring to something by, I don't know, Gracie Fields or something.
Kids are getting smarter, but the rent ain't getting cheaper. Zeitgeist separation and the skin is getting pinker. Houseplants in my future, houseplants new disguise. There's a rotting cesspit, fear in your eyes. Rotting cesspit, fear in your eyes. Houseplants, houseplants. You speak about our days, yeah, we speak about.
What does Making Plans for Nigel mean to Squid?
Well, I guess around the time of writing that track, we'd all been listening to a lot of XTC, and I think musically they've influenced us quite a lot in their eclecticism and eccentricism. Like, I think we have often been a band which straddled genre, and I think they definitely were back in the day. Lyrically, Ollie also took inspiration from Colin Moulding. And in fact, he left a little note for me to say about that lyric because he couldn't join us today. And he said, "In a time where I was working a lot for not much money in London, I felt a resonance with Nigel. There always seems to be a high authority that has a plan for you. I read an interview with Colin Moulding on the bus to work, and he said that he imagined Nigel working in an office. And I thought, that's me. From then on, Nigel became a kind of timeless figure of the young and disenfranchised. And that's why I popped him in the song."
And that sounds very much what you're thinking, Tom.
That's
right?
exactly what I just said, only said it in a much more eloquent and thoughtful way.
But that's Ollie for you. Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he got time to write it down, though. He got time to think about it. And then, Tom, this is then fascinating that you've returned to that character. You've sort of taken the baton from Colin Moulding, written it once, and then you've returned in 2020, 2021 with the Chronicles of Nigel.
Do you remember when we fell in love? Where are we now? What happened to us? Honeymoon ended in a blink. 7 years of dirty dishes piled up in the sink.
And the idea is that you're catching up with Nigel all these years later, is that right?
Yeah, so with my Nigel this time, because obviously in 2009 I imagined if XTC's Nigel was a time traveller or you were able to sort of pick him up and plonk him in 2009 and he'd be the same age and at the same point in his life, but rather than being in 79 he was in 2009. Did that, left it, and then in 2019 or 2018 I think it probably really started, decided to check back in on that Nigel and see what he was up to, where he'd be in his life.
And what we discover, I've had the privilege of hearing it already, and it covers, we've got sour marriages in there, we've got drinking, we've got affairs, we've got street fights, we've got sexual experimentation, we've got split families. It's quite a bleak picture, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty bleak. Yeah, I think it's a reasonably accurate picture, though, of the bits of British society that people don't write songs about. The bits we don't really discuss.
Have you conceived? Because I hear it as a sort of it's obviously as a grouped set of songs, so that makes it a concept album, if you like. Do you see it as a concept album? Do you see it as a stepping stone to a musical? It feels very musical in its tone to me.
It could end up as a musical if you could find a theatre willing to commission a work with the amount of profanity and graphic sexual references in it that there are, which I think you might have a tough job. Maybe a short film, something we are looking into. I am about 2/3 of the way through the script for either a short film or an audio book. So there's the possibility, but to be honest with you, it's been hard enough making the record without the help of a record label. So to have even managed to make the record feels like a huge achievement, let alone anything else that might follow it.
Well, do you want to say something about that? Because it strikes me that you can write Be Somebody, you've got one song, but to write a whole I think have you got 11 songs on this? That means 11 ideas that have got to be different and somehow unified and maybe telling a story between them and so on. That's quite a big undertaking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a crazy undertaking. I wouldn't recommend anyone ever does it. It's taken up 2 years of my life, and it's been really fun at times, and it's been hell at times. But it pushed me in terms of my ability of what I can do. I've spent the last sort of 10 years of my career writing snappy little pop songs with big choruses that people can get drunk to and chant along with, and that's kind of what I do. And to take this on was quite scary. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it because I thought there was a real good chance that we would start it and what I was doing wouldn't be good enough, and I'd have to scrap it, or we'd stumble somewhere along the way, or we wouldn't have the money to do it. But it's a huge undertaking. Having done it though, it's incredibly satisfying listening to a coherent piece of work at the end of it. And so I think it's something that we are definitely going to do again, in terms of a conceptual album with a cohesive narrative all the way through. So it's been very hard, but it's incredibly rewarding. So it'll be repeated.
How do you do it on a practical level? Do you just sit down and start with song 1 and work your way through, or is it I'll write song 5 and then here I've got song 7?
We were incredibly organised about it in a very un-rock and roll and boring way. We started out with mood boards and lists of words. So one of the first things we did was made lists of words that we thought were British that America wouldn't understand. And part of the brief for this was, if America gets this record, we've failed. This needs to be so British that it's almost like an inside joke. And then we did these mood boards of sort of imagery and things. So the film Bob, Sue and Rita 2, which is where the Bob and Sue reference comes from on the record. That the imagery in that is again so British that we sort of, that was always on the mood board, and then just the British attitude to sex and how weird we are about it compared to Europe and America, and so we created all these mood boards before I'd ever written a note, and then in terms of the order that I wrote stuff in, I kind of picked key points on the record. So Ooh La La, the middle point of the record, was one of the first ones that we wrote, just because it gave me a midpoint to sort of swing around. And
Ooh La La, he's had her on the front seat of the family car, in some seedy corner of some old car park. They'd kissed before, but this meant more.
And then the very beginning of the record, once I'd worked out who Nigel was, which again, there was lots of sort of, we delved right into Nigel's life before I'd even written a note. We knew where he lived, what he drove, what his job was, how many kids he'd accidentally have, the wife that he was married to and loved to bits but was dissatisfied with. We knew what carpet he had in his lounge before I wrote any lyrics. And so then sort of started at the beginning, started at the end. So I had these three points, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and then sort of threaded the story along it. And there were some quite tricky points. So track 3, when he spots this barmaid and sort of falls in lust, or he feels he's fallen in love with her, that was a really tricky one to write, because the trick was to get as much information in there using as few words as possible, because it'd be really clumsy if we just told the story in loads of words. The music had to carry a lot of the weight of that, as a sort of a cinematic or narrative telling tool. So it's tricky when you get to the point where you want to express that Nigel's happy with his marriage, sort of, but he's a bit dissatisfied, and he's now seeing this barmaid who he fancies, and okay, he's maybe cheated on his missus before, but is he going to do it again? Looks like he is. And you got to get all that across in one song. Oh, and by the way, he's drunk, and his mate's there, and he needs to put his hand on your shoulder and say, don't let him do it. There were some very tricky tracks to orchestrate.
Both you and Squid started off from the situation of saying you recognise something in Nigel, in Making Plans for Nigel, the original one, that spoke to the experience that you'd had. Do you have to like Nigel, or do you like the Nigel that you find in Chronicles of Nigel as the character you want to spend a whole album with?
I think he's your kind of typical anti-hero. He's you root for him, but he's not a particularly likable chap. You know, he's married with kids and he's made this huge commitment, although he probably hasn't really thought about it. He's found himself married with kids, and he says in track 3 he's cheated on his wife before but got away with it, and he's about to make the same mistake again. And you kind of, that's the point really where you, quite early on in the record, you lose a bit of that sympathy for him and think, all right, this Nigel's maybe a bit of a dick. But he's, but I still root for him the whole way through, and especially at the end when, his whole world's become completely unraveled. And he's starting to even question free will at that point. Is he just a product of his environment? So I root for him, but I don't particularly like him.
What do you call that noise?
Now, Laura, from a musical point of view, do you hear any connections between the music of XTC and the music of Squid?
Oh, yeah. It's something that I really like about the lyrics in Squid. It's similar to XTC, is these kind of observations that, like come from life and the cleaner and stuff. I know that's from when he worked in FOP. And it's really bizarre because I was working in FOP and I loved that song. And I kind of thought because I was always reading the banner saying rock and pop and seeing all the DVDs. And I was like, oh, that is just like my life. And then I realized that he actually went there. But yeah, I was wondering if he keeps or do you share the lyric writing process? And if you keep journals, or how does that work?
We don't, insofar as explicitly share any lyric writing. The lyrics are usually written by the person that sings them, so that's predominantly Ollie, and then Louis and Anton occasionally sing. But it does feel that because we spend a lot of time together and we're good friends with each other, that those ideas conglomerate and then come out in a nice format. I think, especially at the time of Houseplants, we'd all read, to quote not the Mark Fisher here, but his namesake, Mark Fisher, the deceased, had written a book called Ghosts of My Life, which speaks about how lots of musical and art forms are becoming cyclical in quite a depressing manner. And this concept of hauntology, which is, I probably can't do it justice here, but the idea that music and art forms harking back to the 70s and decades that have gone by and not being able to break free of this cycle because of certain references that things always refer back to. And he thinks we've got stuck in a cultural rut, and that was obviously, well, apart from being depressive, partly why, he had a bit of a sad end.
So yes, I've missed my opportunity. As well as having an episode that's about lots of Nigels, I could have had it presented by lots of Mark Fishers. Sadly, he's died already, but there are a few Mark Fishers out there. But that's and in the same way that Tom has an interest in sort of reflecting the politics of his day, it sounds like Squid lyrically is interested in being about something, going to be about life today.
Yeah, I think so. I guess we're constantly changing as a band, which is fun. But lyrically, I think as well, to some extent, I feel like the EP you've heard and that's released is quite observational, like you say, and perhaps this next album, it becomes ever so slightly more inward looking, but still to some extent observing. There's a track which is quite balladian, JG Ballad, in that it kind of takes a reference of the concrete island and looking up at high rises below you, but puts it into a kind of modern day context. And instead of looking up at a few high rises, you're looking at the massive GlaxoSmithKline building as you leave London on the West London flyover.
And let's get a bit of practical information out there. You've been recording the album. You have recorded the album in lockdown. But when will it be? What will it be? When can people hear it, do you reckon?
Very early next year, you'll hear some stuff from it, and sometime in the first half of next year, the album will be released.
And this episode actually will be coming out in 2021. So we're talking about this year now. So it's a 2021 album.
Okay.
And do you have a name for it yet?
Not yet. Not so far as we can disclose. However, depends when this...
We nearly got an exclusive.
Yeah, not yet. But it's coming. Names are hard, we've decided, between the five of us. They often...
The first album by Squid, that could be a title.
Yeah.
I was also listening to an interview where Ollie said that phase 1 of Squid was jazz and phase 2 was punk. And I was just wondering if there's a new direction, or have you evolved? Is it evolved in any way, or is it just combining the two a bit more?
I guess that kind of, like I said earlier, the genres are something we straddle quite a lot. And it's interesting because as soon as we got described as post-punk, I started listening to a lot of bands that were post-punk. I'd never really delved into it as a genre much before. So immediately you kind of get directed down that funnel towards post-punk.
Yeah.
But we've all got a massive variety of musical influences, and some of which definitely don't cross over. You know, I'm pretty big into electronic music myself, but Anton's not so keen on it. But then he's got an incredible understanding of Malian music and the ways in which those two combine. Whether there's a new genre we're aiming at, I don't know. I think the last track we're writing some music at the moment, and the last one sounds like it takes some elements from fugues, with classical fugues. So I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you're bringing more instruments on this album?
Yeah, we've got some tracks were scored for strings and horns. Yeah.
What are your jazz and ambient influences? Because I know Duds and XTC obviously.
Yeah.
But more. I was wondering about the other bands that you like outside of that.
The kind of Southeast London jazz scene at the moment is pretty fun and inspiring. You know, Nabia Garcia and Sons of Kemet, and that kind of scene where it's quite integrated and there's lots of bands playing within quite a small circle near each other. I find, especially as a kind of cornet and trumpeter myself, has been pretty inspiring.
I'm interested in I suppose, because I used to do the XTC fanzine a long time ago, from a long time past, from the early 80s, when people did things on cassettes, people would send me cassettes of their music. And if they were XTC fans, and quite a lot of the time the music sounded like a sort of someone pretending to be XTC but not getting it quite right. And sort of I'm never really interested, and never have been interested in music that's just because it sounds like XTC, because I think, well, I've got XTC already. And it strikes me that the sort of music that I do like, and I would include Squid in this, is that it doesn't sound on the surface at all like XTC, but there's maybe something similar in the attitude and the approach and the eclecticism, the openness to experiment and new sounds and whatever. Do you feel an influence in that sort of, abstract isn't quite the right word, but sort of not on a literal, I'm going to sound like Statue of Liberty?
I don't know how XTC creative processes worked. I know that Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding were songwriters in a sense that's probably quite different from the way we make music. But I think, if you put our five minds into the mind of Andy Partridge, it'd be nice to think that there's some similarities with us five as a macrocosm of what goes on in his head.
Yeah.
Five Squid equals one Andy Partridge.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. What goes on in our rehearsal studio with the five of us is somewhat what's going on in his head, maybe. Which obviously means, because it's his own idea, it does create songs which are more defined and pushed by the lyrics and have a maybe slightly easier structurally to follow. Whereas I feel like ours can be a bit more complex, isn't the right word, because I don't think that. But one person within the band can influence the others, which then takes the music in a different direction. It feels slightly less mono-led, if that kind of makes sense, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. And probably as a result of that, you end up sounding like Squid. You don't end up sounding like anybody else, because you couldn't possibly bring five people into a room and get all of them to contribute and then suddenly end up sounding like anybody.
Yeah.
You're always going to sound the sum of your influences in that
Definitely.
respect.
Yeah.
I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that you grew up listening to XTC, so XTC was a part of your childhood soundtrack, is that right?
Yeah, definitely. My dad's a huge XTC fan, and I feel like he probably embodies the similar ideas of eclecticism and to some degree like British eccentricism, which Andy Partridge had and has, and I think he's pushed that onto me. Yeah, which is good. I feel like it can get to a point in a Squid rehearsal where I'm very not afraid, but I get bored easily by music that sounds like a lot of music that's already come out, especially in the kind of classic rock sense or the like classic punk sense. I don't know. I guess that's why, to some degree, I still play the cornet in the band, because I worry when it gets to two guitars, bass, synth, and drums that it can quite easily end up sounding like a lot of other bands. Yeah.
And yes, it's reminding me, what you're saying is reminding me of a thing I think a lot of musicians say about XTC, is that, just in terms of melody, for example, you expect a melody to go in one direction, then it heads off in a different direction, or you expect a logical third chord after you've played the first two chords, but actually they'll come up with a different one. So there's that sense of continually surprising you and second guessing you.
Definitely.
What do you call that noise?
Back to the Chronicles of Nigel, which is out now and available at tomclarkmusic.bigcartel.com. From a musical point of view, anybody who did grow up with The Enemy and those big choruses, actually, Laura, maybe you want to chip in here, those big choruses of The Enemy and whatever, might be surprised to find the influences I can hear are Broadway musicals, music hall, spaghetti western soundtracks. I don't know if I'm being fanciful there, French chanson, and you've got a duet in there as well. It's a pretty on rock and roll influence, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah. As an Enemy fan, will you be gutted that there aren't sort of massive Enemy choruses, or are you sort of at a point where you could appreciate a song on an accordion that's half sung in French?
Oh no, definitely. That sounds great. No, I appreciate any band that goes in a different direction. And that's something that I liked about XTC and Squid as well. So no, it's cool. I was wondering if did you go on to listen to more of XTC after, like, since you wrote Be Somebody?
Yeah, I've done a bit, but it's like trying to sort of date someone who looks like your ex, because to me, Making Plans for Nigel was, literally every day was the first song I put on in the morning every day for a long time. And so then to play XTC's other stuff is kind of like, what's this? It's not Making Plans for Nigel. It's sort of, I can hear it's them, but it's just, there's this familiar and unfamiliar, and it'll never quite be the same as that one track.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
But I just made this, like, I was trying to make kind of connections between the two, and I don't know. Well, I guess you've probably not heard it, but I thought the song "Day In Day Out," which is about, the lyrics are kind of about working in a shop as well, and about how, like, humdrum and, like, miserable that is, and that's sort of the pathway for many people. I work in a shop, the Co-op at the moment, And I just thought maybe because you have the song Nation of Checkout Girls as well, it's very similar in like ilk of like lyric writing. So I presumed that maybe you had.
Yeah,
because they do the narrative a lot in a lot of their albums. So I thought maybe. Anyway, that was all.
I think it's maybe Pandora's box that you're opening, because I think as a start, I love it when there's a narrative in the song, and if I start to listen to it, it's probably the beginning of more hard 2-year concept records. but yeah, the Nation of Checkout Girls is the same subject matter. You know, it's a play on words of the expression "a nation of shopkeepers," which is what the British are always described as. But you know, we're not a nation of shopkeepers anymore. We tend to not own our own businesses. We're sort of further down the food chain, and I used to work in a co-op shop as well. That's where I worked selling TVs, was a co-op, and so I've felt it and I've lived it, and so it inevitably creeps out in the music. But I think there's a load of disenfranchised young people that end up in bands, and they do one or two things. I think you either write about what you see, which is that reality, or you sort of write about disconnected escapist stuff. For me, the best form of escapism was always reflection. You know, it was always looking back at where I was just before I was in a rehearsal room with a guitar in my hand, or was that a piano, and I don't know. I found it cathartic in a way.
Does that strike a chord with you, Laurie, and
sure.
the approach that Squid take?
I guess less explicitly, because I don't write so many of the lyrics, but definitely feels like your thoughts and feelings of what's going on around you, often, especially in the past year, of the absolute mayhem that's been going on, is reflected in our music, and to some extent the lyrics. Yeah.
The lyrics in Houseplants, by the way, are spectacular. Just amazing. I've spent my time looking for a future that doesn't exist. I think
amazing
could be the strapline for our entire generation. And this is my beautiful house, and I can't afford to live in it. It is. This is my beautiful. Well, you can't see it. My camera's broken. This is my beautiful house, and I can barely just about afford to live in it. And it's a flit between trying to make my garden look immaculate, so I can do an impression of a real adult who's sort of got their shit together, and just the grass being up to my knees. Because why does it matter? Why does any of this matter? We're just cogs in someone else's machine. You know, even when you've broken out of the life that's the obvious, and you know, I'm in a band now. This is my job. It doesn't matter. I'm still a tiny cog in someone else's huge machine, and I'm really just working to make them rich. And so I completely and immediately identified with that. I think it's interesting that both of us have reflected, or both bands have reflected on the 1970s, because for me, I think that's when the tides began to turn. You know, I think there was a level of independence, even if you were. My family tended to be. They were miners, but even then, you had some autonomy. Back then, I think you had, or maybe it's just romanticism, I don't know, but it felt like you had more of an opportunity to be your own person back then, and now it's so difficult to be creative. So I find it interesting that you guys sort of flitted back to Making Plans for Nigel and the 1970s as well, and I wonder if it's a subconscious thing of that's when it began to end. I don't know.
It's certainly written about that was the time when things started to go backwards to some extent. I think I'd maybe say a little bit later, maybe when things started to plateau. Now, you know, you can like listen to. You can do like the classic decade thing, where if you listen to music from the 1950s and then you played something that was made in the 1960s to someone from the 1950s, they might be like, wow, this is completely different to what we call music and what's different. And then whether you could do the same with the 2020s and the 2010s, a lot of people would question, say no, that change hasn't happened. And whether that's, people say music's genres have become saturated and like we've run out sonically of all the ends that we can go to. But I guess you only run out sonically of finding new ends if you believe you've run out sonically of finding new ends. And that's surely a reflection of the greater human psyche and what's going on in the last 40 years. I don't think that's ever something which has actually happened. It's just how people conceptualize what's happened. Yeah, if that makes sense.
And to that, I think we're in a bit of a cultural cul-de-sac. I think it's a reflection of culture's overall lack of creativity and evolution. If anything, I think society at wide is now headed more to a revolution than it is evolution. And I think that music sort of stagnating is possibly just a reflection of that.
And Tom, did you come to a conclusion? Is it too soon to have come to a conclusion that you've been able to revisit your Nigel, your 2009 Nigel in 2020, 2021? Has it allowed you to think about the political conditions of the world 10 years on?
Well, so Be Somebody is, without being overtly political, it's a social commentary, but it has political connotations because it juxtapositions 2009 with 1979. The Chronicles of Nigel doesn't really. It is a social commentary because I think it comments on the fact that there are lots of people our age who end up married who haven't necessarily questioned if that's the life for them. Definitely an awful lot who have unplanned families, again, without thinking about whether that's what they want. And that in itself is a social commentary. And the cheating, the infidelity, I think is a social commentary. But I don't think it goes hand in hand with a political commentary this time, because it isn't juxtapositioned with another time. But I think that in and of itself is quite reflective of a society that has become a lot less political. People nowadays tend to either be very active politically, and you could classify them as political activists, and have very polarizing views, or they're completely detached from it and actually just want to get on with their life and pay their bills because they feel the system's won and they can't change it anyway, and it doesn't matter who they'll vote for. So they're quite detached. And I would put this Nigel in that category, where he doesn't have any sort of political affiliations or aspirations to change the world. He's just trying to stop the kids getting more crumbs in his Audi.
And I can imagine in 10 years' time we'd be able to look back and say, oh yes, that was such a 2020 album. It'll reveal itself, but we need the passage of time to see that difference again.
Maybe accordions are the defining sound of the 2020s. We just haven't figured it out yet.
Yes, you could be riding a wave of sort of, if I'm right with my spaghetti western soundtracks, maybe they're going to be the sound of 2021.
Yeah, maybe.
I've just made a note that back in 2009, Nigel was working in a department store. Just tell us where he's working now. What's happened to him?
It's not made overtly clear on the record because I thought it was important to leave gaps for people to colour in themselves and imagine. But obviously, for me, my Nigel, I know everything about him. I decided he's a PE teacher because it's one of those professions that a lot of people slip into. They leave school, and the way to get a career is to kind of go back to what they know, which is education. And so my Nigel has sort of he's gone and worked in a shop for a bit, but at some point he's obviously got Shelley pregnant, and now he needs to earn a better crust because he's got a kid to look after, which is an honourable thing to do. He tries to get back into a profession where he might earn a little bit more money, but he's definitely not academic, my Nigel. So he ended up being a PE teacher, and in tiny detail that doesn't appear on the record but might appear in the audiobook, he's also the deputy head. But I feel he might have shagged his way into that position because he definitely didn't earn it.
There's a lot of backstory going on here. We'll have to run it past Colin Moulding to see whether he really approves. Actually, that thing about it not being, wanting it not to be meaningful in America. I mean, even the name Nigel is such a British name and a name that's gone out of fashion, really, isn't? Nobody's being called Nigel anymore. It's located very much in that era, isn't it, of his generation?
Yeah, it's a fantastic name, though. If I accidentally have a kid, I'm calling him Nigel. If it's a girl, I'm calling her Nigel. It's an Irish name that means champion. It's a really cool name.
Oh, I didn't know that. Didn't you have a cat called Nigel, Laura?
This is Nigel, yeah.
Oh, that is Nigel.
Hi, Nigel.
Yeah.
Amazing. Hiya, Nigel.
But he's actually named after the lead singer of Half Man, Half Biscuit. It's my dad's favourite band.
Cool.
Yeah. There you go. That's another Nigel.
Yeah, I've forgotten that Nigel. That's a good Nigel.
Yeah. So did you make a musical in 2018, Tom?
I was
at the Belgrade.
Yeah, I was the musical director on the musical.
And did that influence the album now, do you think?
Yeah, massively. I accepted that job with a caveat, which was that they were more than prepared to sack me if I couldn't do it. I didn't think I'd be able to do it. I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never worked in musical theatre. They asked me to do it, and I said, yes, I will do it, as long as within the first 2 weeks, if it becomes apparent to you that I am not going to do this well enough, you fire me.
Yeah.
And whilst working on it, I worked quite closely with a guy called Jeff Thompson, who's a BAFTA-winning writer. Jeff used to work the doors in Coventry. He was a bouncer. And he also worked in a factory, and one day decided that he could write fiction, and has written a lot of very good fiction and won awards for it. And working that closely with Jeff kind of made me just feel like maybe anything's possible. You know, you can do anything. It was really inspirational. And working with the whole cast, who were much more talented than I am, just being around those creative people really inspired me to go, okay, maybe I can, this idea that I've had that I've sort of buried a bit because I thought I can't do it, maybe I can do it. And also, I just watched Jeff weave a narrative through the Enemy album, We'll Live and Die in These Towns, that wasn't there. It didn't exist.
Right.
And he turned the whole record into this one cohesive story. And I thought, if he can do that way round, if he can take a record where there is no cohesive narrative and weave one through it successfully, then surely I can do it the other way around. You know, it should be easier to just write the narrative first and then write the music around it. So yeah, working with Jeff and all those people was hugely inspirational, and I wouldn't have sat down to do this record if I hadn't been in that situation.
Oh, that's really cool. And that's it's interesting how you say like being around other people made you feel like you could do things. Just thinking with the pandemic, that's something that's so hard about now. Just not being around people. I mean, like it gives you time to do stuff, but also not being able to kind of collaborate and meet people face to face makes it harder to, I don't know, see those things through. I know that Mark and my dad are both writers, and they've been stuck at home and not seeing people, and I can see the effect that it has on just getting.
We wilt away.
Yeah.
We end up doing podcasts. That's the worst of it.
Yeah, I'm so glad I'm working at the co-op, just because that's like I'm living with my parents. It's really rubbish, but like working at the co-op is my social life now. It's crazy.
I think that's a really the most poignant thing that's been said in this whole podcast so far is working at the co-op is my social life now. You could probably extract an album out of that.
Yeah. Ollie actually couldn't join us today because he's just got a new job working in a warehouse packing records up. So that's the first non-Squid job he's had since we signed, and it's interesting just to see him going back to that world. Yeah,
I think the creative industries have been completely abandoned throughout all of this, and I know so many people. You know, my wife is a DJ, and her work stopped overnight, and that was almost a year ago now. It's It's crazy, and I know so many. It's not just the creatives either; it's the technical staff. You know, all of my techs who I tour with, my lighting technicians, my sound guys, my stage management crew. You know, they're all trying to find new work, and I know people from the you know from huge tours with massive artists, much bigger than me, who have been doing this since before I was born, who are now working for delivery companies, and I think the effect on the creative industries at large of this whole pandemic, I don't think we've fully realised them yet.
Yeah, because you can't assume that those people will ever go back again. You know, even when things come back, if things go back to normal, they'll now be earning their living on a delivery driver or whatever it might be.
I doubt many of them will, because it was an underpaid, undervalued profession anyway. Most of these positions, it was hard enough for people to justify working in the music industry as it was, as it is at the moment, and as it will be in the near future. I think most people will probably have gone and got a job and gone, I get the same money here, I work less hours, I get to leave my work at work and go home and have a social life, and it's probably a more attractive proposition, which I'm sure the government or someone else could use to argue, well, then they've now got a better quality of life, so it was a positive thing. But it on an individual level, you could argue it's a positive thing, but I think the damage that this will do to the music and the theatre industry and you know, even film and cinema, I think it's going to be quite lasting.
Yeah. Maybe that could be my last question to both of you. Is assuming the vaccine comes into place and assuming things do get back into normal. Tom, will you be touring the Chronicles of Nigel? And Laurie, will my so far unused ticket to see you in Edinburgh, will it come into fruition? Tom first.
Yeah, it's going to be a very difficult record to tour, because if we're going to do it properly, I need to do it with a string quartet and 2 keyboards, and you know, there's a lot of different musical sounds on that record, and I don't know how we would do it live without it costing the earth to put on that show, and frankly, I don't think I sell enough tickets to pay for that. So I don't know. We're going to have a chat with the City of Culture people in Coventry, because Coventry was awarded City of Culture, and that's going to happen in 2021. I know there's a lot of funding for creative and artistic projects, so I'm going to have a chat with them to see if it's going to be within the realms of possibility to release some funding to put the show on, or maybe tour the show. Failing that, we could strip it down and do it a more basic way. I'd love to go out and play it, but it's going to be very tricky to be able to pull it off and do it well, and I don't want to do it badly. So I don't know is the answer. I'd love to, but I don't know is the answer right now.
Yeah. Oh, well, good luck sorting all that out. Laurie, you've talked already. You've got an album in the pipeline, and I presume you're itching to get out live again.
Certainly are. I think June is when we've been told tours will be back on. Fingers crossed, everything goes to plan and we don't go into a third lockdown. And in fact, I saw somewhere that hopefully the Edinburgh gig, when we may potentially be able to meet, will be at the end of May. So that'll be one of the first gigs we do properly. I think before that, maybe there'll be some scope for some socially distanced sit-down shows, maybe in London, but we don't expect to have any proper tours until then, until June. Yeah.
And Laura's got tickets for it as well, so we will be there whenever it comes around. But it's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you very much, Tom. I hope the album goes down as well as it deserves to do. And Laurie, when yours comes out, the same thing. We're looking forward to hearing that. So thank you very much, and thank you to Laura as well. So it's been great to talk to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's really, really great chat.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
What do you call that noise?
You can find out more about Making Pints for Nigel at alphabetbrewing.co.uk. You can find out more about Squid at squidband.uk, and you can find out more about Tom Clarke and the Chronicles of Nigel at tomclarkemusic.bigcartel.com. And that's Clarke with an E on the end of his surname. Thanks again to Alex Parkinson, Laura Wade, Laurie Nankivell, and Tom Clarke, and of course to the Patreon supporters who include Pink Things, Humble Daisies, and these mighty fine Knights in Shining Karma: Matt Anderson, Terry Arnott, Dan Barrow, Matt Bell, Kevin Burt, Liam Duggan, Jamie Dunn, Helen Fay, Robert Graham, Robert Lawlaw, Dennis LeCourrier, Liz Lynch, Murray Meikle, Kevin Murray, Karen Neal, James Newell, Amy Parkinson, Mark Reed, James Reimer, Simon Slateholm, Michael Sutcliffe, Mark Thomas, Nigel Waller, and William Wilkstrom. If you'd like to support the XTC podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Mark Fisher. See you next time.
What do you call that noise?
Head to xtclimelight.com where you can buy my 2 XTC books. First, there's the XTC Bumper Book of Fun for Boys and Girls, which is an anthology of Limelight, the XTC fanzine I made from 1982 to 1992.
We had a couple of lifelines to the world, and Limelight was one of them.
So the book is the XTC Bumper Book of Fun for Boys and Girls. It's stunning.
Thank you, Ian Lee. And then there's What Do You Call That Noise, an XTC discovery book, where you'll find more from the band, plus commentary from musicians including Anton Barbeau.
For me, it's just simply a life-changing song.
Anne McHugh.
It's like a painting by Van Gogh.
Jason Faulkner.
XTC probably made the most impact on me of any band that I can think of.
Chris Butler.
If there's anything more classic XTC, this is it.
And Rick Buckler.
It was well produced as well. It had the support of a great producer. I mean, it really sounded strong.
Order your copies of both books at xtclimelight.com.
It's the paper and ink net, the internet with added staples.